I want to talk about what it's like to be a parent of somebody with an addiction. And so I worked in as a counselor working with people with addiction, and therefore I also worked with parents of children with addiction, and I worked with young people who had addiction. And so that brought me into contact with their parents as well. And and so I saw a lot of parents that were struggling with children that were addicted, and I worked with children who had addictions, and so it brought me into contact with a lot of people that were struggling with their children, and trying to deal with that reality, and also with the tragedy of parents who lost children to their addictions, and how difficult that was. And I also dealt with children who are parents who had adults who were addicted, and how that felt for them. And it's probably one of the more difficult groups of people that I dealt with, because it's a real tragedy when a parent is struggling with their child who is addicted, regardless of age, whether that child is still a child or whether that child is a young adult. It's never easy for a parent to watch their child who is struggling with addiction, and whom they're not sure whether that child is going to survive or not. Especially when the child may be doing or taking opiates, and there's always a risk of overdose. And so it was very difficult, a lot of times, working with parents and their children, because there was always that factor whether that child was going to survive or not. And there were a lot of tragedies at different times when I was working with these groups of people where children did die, and they died of overdoses of opiates. And some of the stories that parents trying to deal with this dealt with, for instance, when they went to hospitals with their children. This was some of the worst experiences that parents described to me, and that would be, taking their young person to an emergency at the hospital, and then being greeted by hospital personnel who just would not admit their child or would not deal with their child, because to them this child was addicted, and right off the bat that was they were not admitting them. And they would get a really negative response from the hospital personnel, like, this the idea of that the child was addicted, or this young adult was addicted. The response was like, very negative, and really rude, really very horrible. Parents would describe feeling like they were being treated in a way that was comparable to the way they treated the child or the adult child who was addicted. It was like really neglectful, very dismissing, very a very rude, sort of abrupt sort of way, that no, we're not going to treat your child, and no, your child's addicted. We're not admitting them. No, we're not going to deal with them. That's the only problem. They're using drugs, and that's what they need to do. They need to stop doing that. And no, we're not going to help. And here's a parent that's desperate. They're desperate about getting help for their child. They're extremely worried about their child, and they would be met with this really negative viewpoint from the hospital. And so, these stories were often really terrible. Sometimes I accompany parents to hospitals on certain occasions, and I could see the same prejudice that the parent was experiencing. So I'm going to tell you some of those stories, because they were really horrible. And you have to understand that when a parent loves their child, and they're really, really worried, and they're fearful. They're fearful that their child might die. They want help for them. They want the best for their child. They're really worried. This is the child that, if it's a mother that they gave birth to, their father, that they have hopes for this child, and they care about them, and so they're trying their best to try and get help for their child. They care about this child, and so they're going to a hospital with all the hopes that something can be done, and they're being greeted by really negative people who who were treating them in much the same way as they would treat the addicted person. To watch this was really horrific. But I'll give you an example of one. I had one mother tell me that her 21-year-old son overdosed at home, and she found him, and she called 911, and she was holding him in her arms, and he died. Essentially, he died in her arms. Now the paramedics did arrive there and was able to revive him, but the fact was he died in her arms, and you can only imagine how traumatic that is you're holding your 21-year-old son whom you love, and he dies in your arms, and just how painful and how traumatic that had been for her. The paramedics arrive, they're able to revive him, thank God, and off to the hospital they go, and they arrive there, and the hospital would not provide a bed for him. They sat him in a chair, and she's like totally confused about this because, okay, he died in her arms, so she knows how serious the situation was. And she's like, why do you have my son in a chair? Like, why isn't he in a bed? I mean, he had died. She's traumatized, and they're like, no, he can sit there. There's no need for a bed, and they're being very negative and like dismissive to her, and she's like, she's reeling from very moments before having held her son who died, and she's not able to understand what is going on at this hospital. Why are they reacting this way? And there's just this cold and rejecting personnel there who don't care at all for this. This guy is just wasting their time as far as they're concerned. They're not interested at all. Their idea is why didn't they just leave him? Like, why revive him? Why bring him into the hospital at all? They should have just let him die. That's their attitude. And here's this mother who's horribly traumatized by the near death and loss of her son. And she's beside herself with the way that she's being treated in the hospital. And no sensitivity to that whatsoever. No attempt to understand her fear and her trauma. And this is not untypical of the way hospitals treat parents who are coming in with their children. I had another set of parents bring their 20-some-year-old son into the hospital who had he had some alcoholism. He was given benzodiazepines to help him wean himself off alcohol. Now he'd never heard of these drugs. He didn't know what they did. He wasn't aware of them whatsoever, and wasn't given a whole lot of information about them that really stuck in his mind anyways. And he took those pills, and he ended up drinking with them. And of course, you can only imagine what the combination did. They're very much like alcohol. And so he became extremely intoxicated and was cooking and ended up pouring burning fluid on his leg, and of course suffering a severe burn. And also in the process of that evening, he broke his shoulder. And so, he went to the hospital because he had very serious burns on his leg and this broken shoulder. He didn't know that his shoulder was broken at the time, but he had this injury. So he goes in, and of course they have no patience for him whatsoever, and they just essentially bandage up the burnt leg and kind of pushed him out of the hospital. He'd mentioned like he had injured shoulder, and I guess they briefly looked at it, but they weren't really hugely concerned. They just wanted to get him out of there because after all he was an alcoholic, and they weren't overly interested. They had the option, that they could have referred him to a medical detox, which was available, just down the street, which would have given him an inpatient medical detox for both the benzo and the alcohol. They chose not to do that for whatever reasons. I have no idea, because I think the parents were looking for that, so without that referral, he couldn't get into a medical detox. And the parents were trying to ask me, and I said, I called that medical detox, and they said, no, we can't take him without a referral from the hospital. And I said, well, he was there, and they didn't make the referral. Well, they said, well, there's nothing we can do. And so I thought, oh my goodness, because I saw him, and the bandages now were falling off of him. The burns were horrible, and the shoulder was horribly discolored. And I when I saw the shoulder, I thought this has to be a pretty serious injury. And it sort of surprised me that they didn't look any further at that shoulder to see what was going on there, because my suspicions were that was a serious injury and it really needed to be looked at. Anyways, it took us about a week before we could get him in a detox outside of the city. That's what we had to do. We had to go outside the city to find a detox for him. And we did send him off to that detox, and they were concerned about the shoulder and went and had it looked at. And of course, the shoulder was broken. So he had been with a broken shoulder for over a week by that point, and was able to get some care. But there's an example. Unnecessary. You're not going to treat somebody because they're addicted to alcohol, regardless of the fact that they have genuine injuries. You're not going to treat them. Like, okay, wow, that's interesting. And this guy wasn't, when he was intoxicated, he wasn't a loud or obnoxious individual. So he wasn't like drunk and disorderly at an obnoxious level. He wasn't that type of drinker when he was drinking. So there was no cause to be that sort of dismissive of him either. And why they didn't, again, refer him to the detox that was down the street, who knows? I guess because they don't have any patience for addicted people, so why bother? And that was exactly, I think, the response to him. Why bother? What's he worth? Which was typical of the responses to addicted people. But think about the parents. The message is, your son's not important enough for us to do anything for him, much less treat his injuries. And again, that was not unusual. That was a typical response by hospitals. Another incident, I was working with a young man that had he had some autism. It wasn't huge, but it was a specific type of autism. He wouldn't have presented as completely autistic. He had an aspect of autism about him, and they caused some difficulties for him. But he had been smoking some marijuana, but some other stuff as well, maybe some spice, and it really had confused his mental capacity to function well, and so he was having some serious difficulties as a result of that. We needed to clear him of that drug before we could probably get him healthier. Anyways, the mom had brought him into the hospital to have him looked at. She was concerned about his mental health, and she called me to come into the hospital because she was worried for him. So I showed up, and I was told, oh, no, you can't see him. He's out of control. And so they had him contained in a room. And I said, well, I know him, so it could be helpful if I could see him, and because he knows me, and he's comfortable with me. So they brought me in, and he was in a room. They had a guard at the door, and I said, would you let me go in? He's familiar with me, and he might be better with me, so they let me in. And he was pacing, and he was a bit agitated, and I just said, hey, bud, it's okay, you can sit down, it's all right, you're okay. And he sat down. Like, it was very quick, it was very easy to get him to respond. And I thought to myself, what in heaven's name had they done, or how had they interacted with him that he was so agitated? Because it was so easy to get him to sit down and relax. And so I was confused about that, because he wasn't hard to really talk with, and if you talk to him like in a kind way. So I thought, what had they been doing with him that he was so agitated? Anyways, the psychiatrist had come down, and she said to me, and in earshot of him, she said, well, there's nothing wrong with him. He's just antisocial, and he just belongs in jail. And I thought, pardon? I said, What did you see him for, 10 minutes, and you think he's antisocial and he belongs in jail? I said, no, he doesn't. He's not antisocial. I said, he has a tiny bit of autism, but he's not antisocial. I said, how would you come to that conclusion? I said, he's definitely not antisocial. I said, I know this young man. That's not what he is. And of course, he'd overheard this, and he came out with his two, wrists together and saying, well, I guess I belong in jail. Okay. Because he heard that. And I thought, how inappropriate and unkind you are to make an assumption like that without knowing this young man. To me, it was horrible. It was an unfair and incorrect, assumption about this young man, and not helpful at all in the least. And I worked with this young man for about 2.5 years, and no matter where I went, I couldn't get appropriate help for him. Everyone would close the door. I remember at one point I tried to form him to the hospital to get him some psychiatric help, because I kept trying to get him somebody that would help him with some of what was going on with him. And I remember them releasing him saying, well, we can't help him because his situation is too complex. And I said, well, he's too complex. Well, I said, who deals with him if he's too complex? Well, apparently nobody. And nobody deals with people that are too complex. So I thought that's quite interesting. So I was left the sole person that was going to help him. And I didn't have all those credentials that the psychiatrists in the hospitals have. So apparently that was left up to me. I wasn't paid the high wages that the psychiatrists in the hospitals are paid. But again, apparently it was up to me to help him get well. And it was incredible. It was incredible. Everywhere I turned, this was the kind of responses I was getting. And so I worked with him for 2.5 years. And he did, in fact, get better. But it wasn't for help from anyone. He had some trouble at one point with the way the police force interacted with him. At one point, he was at a bus stop, and he was witness to something. He had done nothing. And the police asked for his bus pass. He wanted ID, and he showed his bus pass, but they wanted to take it. He didn't want to give it. He felt like that if he gave it, they wouldn't give it back, and he didn't want to hand it to them, so he showed it to them. They kept insisting that he hand it over. He didn't want to hand it over. He ended up arrested. And you can only wonder about that. It's always interesting to me how those kinds of things can happen. And then I remember going down to the court because, of course, I wanted to make sure he was okay. And I spoke with the lawyer, and she was going to go down and see him, so I went down with her. And this is how she figured out that he could assist in his own defense. Because I said he can't. Obviously, he's not mentally well right now. She goes, oh, no, he can. I said, well, I doubt he can because he's not mentally well. And so here's how she determined that he could assist in his own defense. She wrote how he wanted to plea. She wrote innocent on one part of the paper and guilty on the other, and asked him which one he wanted to plead to. And so he would ramble and go on all over the place about any and every subject under the sun, and she would point to innocent or guilty and on the paper. And then he would ramble all over the place and go all over the topics, and she would point at innocent or guilty on the paper. And this went on. He would do it again all over the place, and she would point to either of these two things. And this went on for a while. She would continue to do that, and eventually he pointed to one of them, and then she said, great. She closed her briefcase, and that's how she got her direction. And if that's not absolutely criminal, I don't know what is. Because he obviously couldn't give direction. Just eventually he was going to go with what she was doing. Eventually. And so, that happened. And that's how she claimed he gave direction. It's clear he didn't know what he was doing. Clear. obvious. And I witnessed that. And so I went into the courtroom because he couldn't obviously do this. And I didn't know court etiquette very much at that point. So what I did was something you're not theoretically supposed to do. But so his case came up. And so at some point I just stood up and I walked forward. And the judge is looking at me and says, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I was his counselor." And she said, "Well, you want to say something?" I said, "Yes, I do." And the judge asked the lawyer if the lawyer wanted me to say something, and the lawyer said no. And the judge said, "Well, I'm kind of curious, so I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say." And I said, "Well, I don't think he's mentally capable of being in this court today. I don't think this is reasonable to have him in here as if he can speak on his own behalf." And at that moment, I mean, he engaged in behavior that clearly showed he was unable to function on his own behalf, and the judge clearly saw it and agreed with me, and that case was adjourned at that point. And if it weren't for me doing that, I mean, what was going to go on? Like some sort of charade that was not realistic. And that's like how many people have to just not do their job because they don't feel they need to. And then the other thing I had to do, because he's at risk sitting in a jail cell because he's not mentally well, and I had to call that jail on a regular basis, because I was going in to see him face to face, like not behind the glass, but I was able to go in and see him face to face. But to call them on a regular basis and say, "Look, he's my client, he's there, I know he's there, I'm coming in to visit him, and I'm just letting you know that there were no marks on him when he went in there, and there better be no marks on him when I go in to see him. He better not be injured, because I'm going to go in and see him, and I'm going to see him in person, and he better have no injuries on him." And they claimed, "Oh, no, what? There wouldn't be any injuries on him." I said, "No." I said, "I saw the ombudsman's report, and I saw that the guards had beaten people up who had mental illnesses." And I said, "So I know you do that. I know guards have done it. So I'm just letting you know that he's my client. I'm going to be going in there on a regular basis, and I'm going to be seeing him face to face, and there better be no injuries on him, because if there is, there's going to be some problems, and I will be making complaints. And so I just want you to know that someone on the outside knows he's in there and is advocating for him. And so I'm going to be going in to see him regularly, and he better not be having any injuries on him, because then I'm going to be making complaints. And so he better be kept in a safe condition." And I had to do that regularly just to make sure that he was not harmed while he was there, because he was at great risk. And for those that don't have an advocate, unfortunately, anything can happen, right? And I just wasn't willing to see a vulnerable young man with some mental health issues be harmed while he was in jail. So those are all things you have to do. I mean, you can't leave it for granted, take it for granted that somebody will be safe, because they won't necessarily be safe. They are at risk of being beaten up by anyone, either by other inmates, but very clearly in this case, he was at risk of being beaten up by the guards because he wasn't well, and he could have so easily antagonized somebody, because he was looking at times to be, beaten up by people. He would say to the police, "Go ahead, kill me," stuff like that. So he wasn't well. So, you have to look out for your clients if there's mental illness. And frequently with addiction, often mental health issues were present. And so these people were much more vulnerable than your average person, And so you had to take those extra precautions. And you knew, like, I thought, okay, I'm going these extra steps to try and safeguard this young man, but look at how many people that don't have those people looking out for them. Anything can happen in those cases. So there were so many parents that, they went through so much with their kids, and And what did they do if there wasn't somebody advocating, if someone wasn't making those calls on a regular basis to the jails to make sure that their children uh, weren't at risk? And it was so upsetting at times, the positions that parents were in with their children, and not being able to safeguard them, and not being able to be treated well by the system at any door that they knocked on, and being having their, like, just no hope, no hope. Working with a woman whose, you know, child was out there, and there was nothing she could do. Just not knowing day to day what to do, because all the doors would shut on our child, because the child's addiction was out of hand. And so housing, like, you know, the shelter shut their door on her, and because she break the rules. Of course they break the rules. They're addicted. They can't obey the rules. They can't follow directions because they're addicted. They don't come in at curfew. They don't, you know what I mean? They're not doing what they're supposed to do. Then they get barred from that shelter, and now they're on the street. Now it's going to happen. You know, it would be endless worry. And they can't bring them into their home because, you know, they'll steal them blind. They'll steal everything in the house and sell it. You know, this is the problem with the addiction, right? Because the person with the addiction is trying to feed the addiction, and they're going to do anything they can to feed that addiction. These are the aspects that make addiction difficult. A person with addiction are primarily focused on feeding that addiction, and that's the behavior. And it doesn't matter who you are, to them, they're going to try and find a way to get from you anything they can. And that includes anybody offering services to them. When I worked with certain populations, I couldn't leave them in my office and say, go and make a photocopy. I had to remove them from my office, lock the door, and go and make a photocopy. Why? Because if I step out of my office for a moment, they'd steal everything in that office. They just would. I mean, there's no, that's a fact. You couldn't turn your back on them for a second. They'd steal everything. And you could say, oh my God, that's deplorable, but that's survival for the addict. They're looking to feed their addiction. Their behavior, yes, is deplorable. They will steal everything in sight they can get their hands on in order to feed their addiction. I mean, I'd been in a agency once where we had a group room with a VCR, and the person's trying to walk out the door with the VCR. And it's like, where are you going with the VCR? And they'll come out with stuff like, oh, I was just looking at it because it's a lot like the one I have. Well, you needed to unplug it and walk out the door to look at it. You know, it's so implausible an explanation. You know, go put it back down. You know what they're doing. And they can't stop it. It's a constant need to feed their addiction, to take whatever they can get their hands on, to sell it, to get the money to feed their addiction. They got to constantly do it. And that's, so you can't have them in your home, because they'll steal every single thing they can get their hands on. If you're out of your house, they're going to steal your VCR, your computer, your TV, your stereo, whatever. They're going to take everything that's of any value, your silver, your jewelry, you name it, anything that's got something they can sell to get money. They're going to take it and sell it. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're their mother, their brother, their sister, their husband, their own children. It doesn't matter, the Xbox, whatever it is, it's going. They're going to sell it for. So you can't have them in your house. They'll take everything. So you can't have them there. They'll demolish your place. You can't even guess how far that could go. So it's really hard for families. They can't have that person living there because they'll demolish everything. And it's not because they hate you or they don't care about you. It's because they're focused on their addiction, and there's no help. And they can't do anything to help them, but they can't bring them home because this is what's going to happen. And so they're out on the street and they can't help them. They can't get them into treatment because they have to make a choice, and they're not going to make a choice because they're addicted, and they're not, you know, everybody out there is saying, well, they have the right to make a choice, and that's the system, and the system is not giving any other options. There's no, we're not, they can't force them into treatment. The society is telling us, well, it's their choice. They get to make a choice, and they have a right, and yet nobody else has any rights while this individual is wreaking havoc. And I've watched people come out of stores and smashing the cases of the items that they've stolen, throwing the items into their pack sack and taking off because they've just ripped off numerous electronics. They're going to get on the bus, drive down the street, get off at the pawn shop, go in and sell that stuff for whatever money they can get, and off they go. And they've got some money for drugs, and that's just constantly ongoing what they're doing every day. It's a constant war to get the money to buy their drugs, and then so now the thought is, okay, we'll just give them their drugs and that should solve the problem, right? No, it doesn't. They go and get those drugs and they need more, because you're never going to give them as much as they need, because they need a constant supply. So you have to just, if that's what you're going to do, you have to give them as much as they want. So you have to be open 24 hours a day and you have to be able to come and get as much as they want every day. You have to give them an inexhaustible supply. That's how you'll feed that. Because if you're only going to give them so much, they only can get so much, then they're going to go and get whatever they can get from you, and then they're just going to keep going to get the street drugs, and that's going to keep going and keep going and keep going, and that's the way it is. Like this foolish idea that you're going to give them the drugs that they need and that's going to solve the problem. You'll never give them enough. You'll never give them enough because it's more. You don't understand it. It's more, it's more, it's more, it's more. So they get the drugs you give them at the pharmacy, because the pharmacy is now giving Dilaudid and methadone and amphetamines and benzodiazepines so that they get the full, complete range of drugs they want, and then they go and get some more off the street, because that's not enough for them. If you think that's enough, you're foolish. So they get your drugs, and then they go get some more drugs, and so they still got to steal and rip off, and that stuff doesn't end. So, you think you're providing everything they need, and you're not providing everything they need, because addiction is about more. It's about more. It's about more. And you're not going to give them more. You're going to give them a limited supply. There's no limited supply in addiction. There's no limited supply. It's always more. So your idea is not going to work. And it's the same. We provide all these resources for people who are addicted, because we're trying to help them out, give them clothing, give them a food bank, try and give them the things they need. Well, they know where every free resource is, and they go and take advantage of every single free resource, and then they sell it for drugs, because that's what they do. They don't need your free resources for themselves. They just collect everything they can get, and then they sell it, and they sell it for money to buy drugs. And it's to understand that people think they're doing all these wonderful things and they've figured it all out, and they'll even ask addicted people, what do you think you really need? Like, what would work for you? They're going to tell you whatever they think you want to hear, and it'll work for them, because whatever you give them, they'll just sell for drugs. Like, they're not going to tell you that, because if they tell you that, you're not going to give it to them. If they said to you, I just need some money so I can buy more drugs, you're not going to give it to them. Or if they said, you just need to give me as much drugs as I want, you're not going to give them that. But they know if they say, well, I just need more clothing or more food or whatever, you'll give them that, and they can just sell it for drugs. They're not stupid. They're definitely not stupid. They know how to get what they want, and they know what to tell you. to get what they want. And you don't understand that because you don't understand what it's like to be an addict. You can't think from that position, and you're naive enough to believe that you can do, you can come up with the right thing to help them, but you don't understand addiction. And addiction is it's insidious and it's overwhelming. It's a one-track mind. I just need more. I just need more. I just need more. It's never enough. It's never enough. It's forever the hunt. Forever the hunt. It eats you alive. Addiction does, and you don't care what you do. Because you're dying for that next drug, and you don't care what's in your way because you're going to get it out of your way, and you're going to get what you want. And it's what's the hardest when you stop is when you come to the realization, that what you've done, what you've done to people and how you've treated people in your life in order to get the drug. It's really hard to come to terms with that, but that's what people do. They will do whatever they need to do to get that drug. The other thing that's difficult about the addiction, well, again, it's what people do to get that drug. And so the harm that's done to other people, and how of little importance everyone else becomes in the face of the addiction. And when that happens, it's how dangerous that the addict becomes to everyone around them, because again, what they will do in the name of the addiction, and if you're between them and that addiction, what they're willing to do to you. And that's the dangers there, that other people are harmed by people's addiction. And the most vulnerable, of course, group of that is children. So what happens when the addicted person has children? And again, I'm going to tell you, the addiction is more important. And that's the danger when there's children. Because the addicted person will use children to their advantage as well. They will use children, every bit to their advantage. Because, of course, having children means you get access to things. And they know that. They know that if they have a child in the home, they get access to stuff. They get access to some money because they have a child. And they'll use that. And they get access to sympathy if they have a child. They can, they get a lot of mileage out of a child. And they'll use that. And in the addiction, it's very hard for them to truly love their children, because they'll love the addiction first and the child second. And that's a very dangerous place for a child to be, because when they come second and the addiction comes first, the child can really be harmed by that fact and neglected and hurt in all sorts of ways. When an addict is going through withdrawal, or they're struggling to get their drug, they don't have it, that child's in danger. And so when the nasty side of I need my drugs comes up and I don't have them, you don't want that child to be anywhere near that person during that period of time, because it's not going to look good for the kid. The kid is needy and the parent is looking for their drug. Not a good combination, because they're not going to have too much patience for the child. And it can be really not a good place for children. Addicted parent and child, it's not a good combination. And over we do everything we can to keep that child with that parent. And I have to tell you, it's not a pleasant place to be. And I look at that from my own experience. I love my mother very dearly, and she tried her best to raise her children, but her addiction hurt me tremendously, and robbed me of my childhood. And regardless of the fact that I loved her, It damaged me. It damaged me terribly, terribly. Um, I did not have a childhood because of my mother's addiction to alcohol, and I was harmed emotionally, severely, by what she did, and I became alcoholic. I think for good reason, and that was my mother's addiction, her alcoholism, and therefore it damaged a large portion of my life. Totally damaged my self-esteem and my sense of self. Was horrendously damaged by my mother's alcoholism, regardless of the fact that I loved her. That damage was done, and that's what happens when someone is addicted and they're a parent, whether they want to or not. Everything that comes with addiction is really, really nasty and ugly at times. And when there's a child around, there's huge danger for that child. And you can't take back the things that parents say to their children, and those are scars that stay on that child's mind right into adulthood. And they really impact that person. And they can stay for a lifetime. And they can sometimes never be erased. And is that really fair? So I really question whether people with addiction should be allowed to have their children, period. I really question that. And because the damage is horrific. It just is. It's just horrific. I've seen plenty examples of it. Plenty examples where it just was horrendous to watch what parents could do to their children while they were addicted. It was just over and over. You could just see this utter callousness that came from the parents while they were addicted. And, you know, all they have to do is look good for a bit for the CAS worker, and, you know, they squeaked under a lot. It's easy to do it. You know, all you have to do is, you know, look good when you're outside your door and be ugly while you're in it. There's so many ways to squeak by and not be detected. And let me tell you, you know, it can be a life sentence for a child growing up in those environments. So it's really upsetting for me, the fact that so many families get to be blessed with children that they do nothing but destroy because of their addiction. Addiction and children don't go together well at all. And I just do not, you know, the parent can cry up and down how much they love their children, and I tell you, if they're addicted, they love their addiction more. They just do. Because if they really loved their children, they'd go backwards, left and right, to get rid of that addiction. And if they're not doing that, they don't love their children. They love their addiction. That's just straightforward as far as I'm concerned. If they aren't going through leaps and bounds to get rid of that addiction, they love their addiction more than their children, and they should not have their children. I'm sorry, that's just straightforward as far as I'm concerned. And that's just from seeing over and over and over the damage that addicted people do to their children. It's just horrendous as far as I'm concerned. And having been personally affected by it, I know how it can be. I know it can how bad it can be. And it's a life sentence. It's a daily, hourly, minute by minute life sentence when you are a child of an addicted parent. You are at their mercy. And it's not pleasant. It's not pleasant. So, you know, that's a horrendous world to be in. And it really needs to be understood. It's so easy for everyone to fight for the parent. Oh, they should have their children. Wait a second. There's a vulnerable child there. You need to be thinking about that person first. Because that's their whole life. You're about to shape their life in that environment. Are you sure you want to put that child there? So I really think you need to think about it. And think about it damn seriously. Because you're about to affect the life of that person. You really want to do that? Is that really what you want to do? Is that person really going to be a good parent? Is their addiction dealt with? If they haven't dealt with it, if they're not willing to go to the ends to deal with their addiction, then do you really want to put that child with them? Because if they're not, that's my thought. If you're not willing to go and get that addiction dealt with, then really, should you be a parent? I don't think so. You obviously don't care enough about that child. You care about your addiction, your drug first. Then keep your drug and let's put the child with somebody who really wants the child. I'm sorry for overemphasizing this, but that was some of the biggest tragedies I ever saw. And if you ever saw a child shaking, a day old shaking wrapped in a blanket from withdrawal, it's not pleasant. It's not pleasant. Just isn't. And it's a hard thing to see. The other thing that I find also difficult is the system not responding, and this idea that people need to make a choice because we can wait till the cows come home, and if you're addicted, it's very hard for people to make a choice. And so people are not really likely to get better this way. I don't think we're going to see a lot of people given an option now, because we give people the option of, we can give them all their drugs so they don't really have to stop using. I was grateful that when I finally got some help, that it was really focus was on abstinence back then, and I was able to get off all the drugs that I was using and choose abstinence, because being drug free and alcohol free has been a really good thing for me, and I'm very grateful. Back then I would have been really happy if someone said, oh, well, you don't have to stop using and we'll give you all your drugs. I would have been happy to do that, but my life would be substantially different if that was a possibility for me. So I'm really glad it wasn't. I'm so glad it wasn't, because I don't even want to think where my life might have been, but it wouldn't have been very nice. That I can be sure of. And so that's more the option now. So it's bleak. That seems bleak to me, because I can't see people coming out of that hole with that as the option. Because I think too many people will choose that. And unfortunately, because it's so easy, Somebody said, well, Karen, you don't have to stop using, and we can give you all the drugs that you currently use. We'll give you a prescription for them. You can go every day and get them. Wow. And then the reality that, of course, that would not have been enough. I would have still been using street drugs. Because, of course, you cannot give me enough, And that's the more principle you don't get. It's always wanted more. So you'd never be able to give me enough. And I'd still be hunting for the extras on the streets, right? So it would be that miserable world. I'd probably be dead by now. Because for sure enough, I wouldn't have gotten enough from you. And then I would have went hunting on the streets, and by, some terrible fate, either the dealer would have killed me, or I would have OD'd on fentanyl or something. By now I would have dead. That would have been the end result. And that's not what I would have wanted to happen. And just seems like a dead end that we've provided, a dead end for people. And it's despairing, for me to know that that's what we're sort of promoting, and we're not promoting better health and recovery and a better life, because people could have a better life. I mean, I can speak to that. I found recovery. I found a better life. I was able to deal with all the hurt that I had gone through as a child and recover from that, and start a different life, and really create the life that was going to be mine. And I've gone through a lot, and even working in the field, working in the field of addiction has been really difficult. I worked 27 years in this field and finally had to leave it because it was despairing when I realized that the idea about addiction had shifted to such a, a dark place that we weren't going to treat it anymore, that we were just going to sustain it. And I'd just seen so much tragedy. And I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't watch the deaths. I couldn't watch the doors that shut, the prejudice. Because the prejudice, like I said, that fell to, parents watched it. Their children that they couldn't get help for. How many times I went with people and the door slammed shut. But also that the prejudice attached to us, to the people that worked in addiction. That we were treated in a negative fashion. And so it actually attached to us. And that it attached to us financially, that we couldn't get paid a decent wage because we were addiction counselors. It didn't matter how much education we had. We still were painted with that brush. And we were looked down upon, and like we didn't have a lot to offer, or somehow we weren't educated or professional enough. It was amazing, I have good credentials. I'm a registered psychotherapist today. I have a lot of education, plenty of it. I mean, I've had no other choice but to become educated because nobody wanted to deal with the clients I was working with. I had to educate myself. Who else was going to help them? Nobody. The doors shut every time. So I had no choice but to go get educated because I had to help them myself. Nobody else was going to help them. Every time I ran into something, I had to go take a course or some form of education to help me deal with that problem because no one else was going to help me. Door would shut. Nobody would deal with it. So I learned a lot of things over the years. I had no choice. I had to learn them. And yet still I wouldn't get an increase in wages. Nobody paid for the courses I took. I just paid for it myself because there was no money for that. Because you're in this underfunded, underpaid job. No one's going to pay for a course on brain injury. You got nothing there. So if you want to understand your client's brain injury and you need to take a course on brain injury, you're going to pay for it yourself. You just did it. I mean, I just did it. Not a lot of other people I know did, but I did. I educated myself all along the way. Whatever I encountered, I went and took courses on to try and see if I could figure out how to help my client better. And so I got more and more education as I went along, but I didn't get a cent more in pay. And the door still kept shutting, and the tragedies kept happening, and nothing improved. And you kept accumulating the tragedies. Because the system didn't function right. And after a while, you get so tired of the doors slamming. You're trying to get your client in the right place, and yet you'd almost get them through the door, and the door would slam shut over and over. I don't know how many times I did that, to the point where you were so tired of it. Umpteen forms and crap that you'd fill out and, go through all the bells and whistles and get the person right to the door, and then they'd slam the door shut. Or you'd get them in, and you'd kick them out. And it was like endless frustration. Endless frustration. And clients that you lost because you couldn't get them into the right resources. And eventually the clock tick, 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 and eventually you lose the client, because how long can you keep doing that for before you lose them because you can't get them where you need to get them? And it drove me nuts after a while, just craziness. And you just get tired, and you go to all the right meetings, and you try to contribute to the conversations and point out the areas that need to be looked at closer, and you try to put your your point of view forward and contribute to the discussion. But I remember going to a discussion where you think you're going to be able to contribute, and they would fix it so that they streamlined the conference in a way that you could only answer the questions that they determined they were going to ask. You couldn't answer any other questions. They determined the questions. They determined how you were going to answer the questions and what form you were going to report on those. So it's interesting. They constructed it so that they could determine exactly what the output was going to be. So it's like you don't really have a contribution at all because they're structuring the thing so tightly that you can only possibly have this output. And I remember thinking, well, that's really interesting because you didn't invite me here for my contribution at all. You invited me to validate your own ideas, and you've set this up so that's the only thing that I can possibly say, because that's how tightly you've set this up. There's no other way that I can contribute anything, other than what you're asking me to. Like, you've literally designed this in such a way that nobody here could have a different opinion because you've set it up that way. And I thought that was like really ingenious. I thought that's really ingenious. You're really smart to have done that because no one here could have an independent thought if they tried to. So that was typical too, and I thought, wow, are we afraid of anybody else's opinion or what? You're making darn sure nobody has an opinion. And I saw this over and over because I volunteered on a lot of different committees and stuff, hoping to have, some sort of contribution to the subject. And over I saw how places did this, and I thought, well, isn't that neat? They all do it. They set it up so that you couldn't have an opinion if you tried. They've got it so tightly fixed that the only thing you could possibly do is give them the answer that they want you to give them. That's how they've set it up. I thought, wow, that's clever. That is really clever. Except how useless is that? And that's common. That's really common. Ingenious, though. Absolutely ingenious. And that's typical. That is very typical in mental health and substance abuse. Highly typical. That's what they do. They want your opinion, except they don't. They want you to affirm their ideas, and they set it up so that you don't have any other option. You're going to have to affirm their ideas. They don't give you any space but to do that. And it's really disconcerting that that's what these places do. My God, are they afraid or what? So very disconcerting for me to see that. Heaven help us if you might have a difference of opinion. That might scare them. So they're making darn sure you don't have one. So you don't even have a space to have a real discussion. And it's very frustrating for me to see that, because where are we ever going to have an honest discussion about addiction if you're not allowed to? And, I've said this over and over. We never present the true story of addiction at any table. We're always a very one-sided, one sliver of the story of addiction every time we come together. And that's why we never get anywhere, because we never put the whole story. And here's the whole story, and you have to put it on the table, because if you don't, you'll never get anywhere. So we have the story of the person who's addicted, and let's tell the whole story, because it's not just poor me, poor addicted person. Okay, it's not just that. So we have an addicted person and what addiction really means, and it's not just this is a terrible disease and look at this person, because it's certainly that. That's one piece of it. And then it's what does addiction do to other people, because that's really important. And if you're not looking at that, you're not looking at the whole picture. So what does addiction do to a person? That's one part. What does somebody's addiction do to other people? That's another part. So to their family members, to their children, to their parents, very important. What does addiction do to a community? That's really important. How does that person's addiction affect the neighborhood, affect the community? Very important. How does addiction affect businesses? So what is the criminality factor? That's really important. Should be on the table. That needs to be looked at. What are addiction contributing to the crime rate? What's addiction doing to businesses in the neighborhood? These people are fed up. They should get a space at the table. When you don't give these people a space at the table and you ignore that that's an issue or they're being harmed by that, they're not happy. You'll never get them on board with anything you say unless you bring them to the table. And every time we ignore those facts, those people get ticked. So they should have a chance to weigh in. We don't include them. We don't help them understand what's going on. They're never going to be our allies. And you are just going to have this continual cycle of frustration. They get to be at the table. We get to be able to do something about this because they belong there too. So you got to look at it all. Okay? The addict, that person, the family, the parents of the addicted person, the children of the addicted person, the neighborhood, how's that being affected? What's it like to live in a highly addicted neighborhood? How does that feel? What's that like for the people who are trying to have a normal life? And their neighborhood is riddled with people who are addicted and needles and, people yelling, I'll give you a blowjob for $20 and their kids are out there. Come on, man, think about that. Businesses where on a daily basis they're being ripped off and because somebody's trying to feed their habit. How about that person? How do they feel? You ever ask them? Because when you don't, what do you think that says to them when you don't include them? You don't think they have a place at the table? Yes, they should. They're being affected. So these are all the neighbors who are really tired of all that. Don't think they have a place at the table? You're ignoring them. They have a right. You have no right to exclude people who have a place at the table. And yet you don't want to ever go there. It's always one-sided. And then you wonder why we never get anywhere. All these people have a right to have a place at the table. And that's the discussion that needs to be had. You have to look at it all. Stop acting like the other parts don't exist. Because they get pissed off when you don't talk about them. Like you don't care about what's happening to them. They want to be heard too. And stop pretending that it doesn't happen. It happens every single day. And stop acting like you know what addiction is. Like when you do harm reduction people act like they're some sort of God-saving, single-minded, caring, addicted, care about addiction people, care about addiction more than anybody else. Oh, get off of it. You don't even understand addiction, because if you did, you'd know that some of the stuff you're doing isn't helpful. Like, I get so tired about the soapbox harm reduction people who stand there and think they understand addiction more than anybody else. Quite the opposite. You're actually quite foolish and you don't get addiction very well. And maybe you need to get off your soapbox for a bit and get a clear understanding, because some of your practices are right on, and then some of your ideas are rather naive. And maybe you need to get off your soapbox and maybe get a clear idea of what addiction truly is, because you're really naive. You really don't get it. So some of your ideas are not particularly smart. And so, maybe you should ask an addict who's recovered some of this stuff, because I'll tell you the truth. I'd have nothing to gain by telling you the truth. The people who are addicted, they got a lot to gain by telling you anything, because they know what they're going to do, and they know what they're going to tell you and why they're going to tell you. I got nothing to gain by telling you the truth. I'm not going to benefit by anything I tell you. So I'll tell you the truth. You're not going to give me anything in return for that. But anything the addicted person tells you, they're going to get something in return for that. You need to think about that for a moment, because you're very naive, and some of your practices are doing nothing to help whatsoever. All of your safety stuff is 100% on. Like that's super important. But some of your other ideas are not healthy, and you're a bit arrogant, and you need to think about that. It just frustrates me when I get that reaction. Like, I'm anti harm reduction. Of course, I'm not anti harm reduction. I think it's extremely important to have it there. We save lives with harm reduction, but there's some ideas that need to be looked at a little bit more realistic, because you obviously don't understand addiction. Because some of your ideas are naive. They're extremely naive, and they're missing a large part of the picture. And that's because you're not addicts. You just, and those that you might have that are active addicts involved in harm reduction, they're also not going to tell you the truth, because there's some advantages to what they will tell you, because of what they can get. And again, I'm not an active addict, so there's nothing I can get from you. So there's no need for me to lie to you, because there's no benefits to my doing that. But and it's just a sore spot, because I think giving addicted people all the drugs that they need to use, you're not doing that, because you're only giving them a certain amount of drugs. They still use straight drugs. It's just a reality. It's not the answer. It just gives them another source of drugs. It doesn't solve the addiction problem, nor does it solve the source of their drug problems. They'll still go get other drugs. It's never going to be enough. You're not going to supply what they need. That's just a source of drugs that they now have. It's not the total source. They'll still need more. They'll still go to the street, because you're never going to give them as much as what they need. You have to give them inexhaustible supply, by the way. If that's what you're doing, you have to just allow them to come and get as much as they want. And I don't think you're going to go down that road. So it won't work unless you do that. Unless you say you can come and get as much as you want whenever you want, 24 hours a day, that won't work. You have to figure that one out. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. That notion won't work until they get the inexhaustible supply 24 hours a day. Because that's my problem with, that's my only problem with harm reduction, by the way, that one. The rest of it is great, and so, like I said, we just need to look at it realistically, and that's my problem. I don't think people have looked at addiction realistically from all those sides, and we all think we're doing really great stuff, but we don't sit down and all have an honest chat. We're all defending our corners. I stepped out, so I don't have much of a corner anymore. I left it because I couldn't watch it anymore. I couldn't participate in it anymore. I accumulated too many tragedies. I accumulated too many horror stories. I got tired of the futility of it all. I work in addiction in a very minor way now. It's not the majority of what I do anymore, because it was taking a toll, and I couldn't do it. I just it took the best out of me, and I realized that I didn't have any ability to. I had to accept I had very little ability to make any changes. That the system was going the direction that it was going in, and I tried everything I could to have an ability to change things, and I had to